Sego Skenagal. Greetings, and may you enjoy great peace. I've been asked to speak about ethical issues in Indigenous health and health research, but before identifying issues, I want to share some observations on ethics and worldview. And what do I do? Push the green button? Okay. We're all familiar with ethical codes that have been developed to guide the practice of professionals in health and scientific research. The TCPS policy statement, updated in 2010, begins with articulating the underlying value of respect for human dignity and the principles by which that respect is practiced. The TCPS introduces the perspective that research participants are more than individuals floating in isolation. Their autonomy and welfare is influenced by the web of relationships in which they're enmeshed, and their well-being, in turn, affects wellness in their communities. Researchers, and this isn't always recognized, researchers also act from the context in which they're embedded. An awareness of the influence of relationships and worldview on researcher and participant, and the way those worldviews interact, are particularly important in research involving Indigenous populations because of the profound effects colonization has had historically and continuing into the present. The traditional worldview of Indigenous peoples is often described as holistic, and you've heard that word a number of times this morning. That means that any phenomenon is best understood or experienced as part of a whole. A Cree colleague defined ethics as the way we treat one another, a way of being and acting that pervades all of life. And I've attempted to represent this in the symbol of a tree. The small branch, the individual behaviors are the leaves of the tree that wither or thrive. The small branches are the protocols that guide interactions of everyday life. The large branches are what might be called ethical codes, unwritten and often unspoken. The trunk of the tree represents values, deeply held beliefs about good and evil, and the roots of the tree represent worldview, the conception of reality that supports the whole organism. Surrounding and nourishing the organism is the earth that supports our feet, the unseen world of spirit. Indigenous languages were often described by social science researchers as concrete, not adapted to communicating complex ideas, notions. Nothing could be further from the truth. Before contact with Western cultures, and even in early contact area, our nations lived in organized communities with systems of thought and governance and economics and social relations and spiritual practices that sustained them. The official story of relations between Indigenous peoples and colonists paints us as savages outside the circle of civilized life, left behind by the march of settlement and progress because we were unable to adapt. In reality, our distinctiveness as people has been regarded as disability, occasionally a threat, and often a burden. For 150 years, public policy was directed to extinguishing our cultures and identities and displacing us from our homelands. Our lands were alienated from us, and our economies decimated. Our governance structures were made illegal or irrelevant. Our languages and sacred ceremonies were suppressed. Our histories were ignored in favor of stories of colonial triumphs. And our families were systematically fragmented by forcible removal of successive generations of children. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015 named these practices together as cultural genocide. Since 1982, the Constitution has protected Aboriginal rights, and surely the fundamental Aboriginal right is survival as peoples, thriving, contributing, self-determining partners in confederation. My brother, the late Dr. Claire Brant, was the first psychiatrist in Canada of Indigenous origin. He named the principal threats to mental health in Aboriginal people as poverty, powerlessness, and anomie, which is detachment from moral and ethical systems of the community. That diagnosis applies to physical and population health as well. And the current inequities in well-being have not become entrenched because of our people's disability. They have been engineered by public policy, maintained by institutions and the complicity of professionals, and enabled by the blindness and deafness of citizens who now say defensively, "I never knew." Thomas King, who was quoted by Malcolm, wrote a story about the trouble with stories, and he ends each chapter or each section saying, "Now you've heard the story, you can't say, 'I never knew.'" In prevailing conditions, biomedical interventions alone, whether via services or research, are ineffectual to heal communities and nations. The theme of this gathering is to examine what can be done differently and who is responsible for effecting change. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has done an enormous service to Canada. The Commission was charged with illuminating a historic violation of human rights in Indian residential schools and pointing the way to reconciliation. The TRC report and the work that they did over 6 years raised the discourse from restitution to 80,000 injured survivors to focus on the grander purpose of reconciliation. And reconciliation they defined as establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. Reconciliation has become a mantra, taken up in many sectors of Canadian society. Understanding the implications of creating mutually respectful relations will require a lot of self-examination and a lot of learning by Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples and individuals, because we have become rigid, fixed in expecting attack. And it takes a lot of work to build those bridges of mutual respect, even with the well-meaning and responsive researchers who show up. To quote a Supreme Court ruling and admonition, let's face it, we're all here to stay. Other sessions in this meeting are taking up the question of what can be done differently. I turn to the question of who is responsible for effecting change? And of course, the pat answer is everyone is responsible. But the reality is that when everyone is responsible, no one takes responsibility. And the members of this panel have witnessed over decades waves of public concern that subside as the media move on to other events. My challenge to you as health sciences is to acknowledge the power that you have to make Indigenous health a top priority for the next 20 years, employing your voice and your actions. In 1922, Dr. Peter Bryce published a book titled The Story of a National Crime, documenting the appalling state of health and well-being and living conditions of Indigenous children in residential schools. He personally attempted to bring his findings to the attention of politicians, media, professionals, and the public. And for his trouble, he was eased out of his position in public health. For close to 100 years, the rates of morbidity and mortality and the many forms of abuse suffered by Indigenous children were known only to those who suffered trauma and its consequences. Cindy Blackstock, a contemporary children's advocate, posed the question to 150 academic researchers earlier this summer: why did an ongoing national crime remain invisible for a century to researchers committed to extending the boundaries of knowledge? Somewhat surprisingly, research has become an instrument for stemming the ills that beset us. The importance of research was recognized in Indigenous circles when assertion of rights to traditional lands was advanced by research, carried out with the assistance of academic allies. Collaborative research gained wider community acceptance with the work of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which adopted and implemented ethical guidelines for Indigenous research. The CIHR Institute on Aboriginal Peoples' Health, launched in 2001, set a priority on articulating ethical guidelines for health research with Indigenous peoples. CIHR was out front in consultation with communities, publishing CIHR guidelines for health research in 1997 and earning accolades around the world. The CIHR guidelines were incorporated in Chapter 9 of the Tri-Council Policy Statement, and the policy was adopted by CIHR, SSHRC, and NSERC in 2010. My colleague, Willie Ehrman of the First Nations University of Canada, has introduced the concept of ethical space to researchers' vocabulary. In a notional ethical space, knowledge workers, researchers who come from different directions and experiences, suspend their preconceptions to the extent they are able, and work together to extend the boundaries of knowledge to the benefit of both worlds. We're not there yet. Researchers tell us that universities and research institutes in the first instance are gatekeepers and keepers of narrow gates on what proposals will go forward. Reviewers convened by CIHR and other agencies use lenses that are often ill-suited to evaluate Indigenous projects and researcher teams. And as others have mentioned, the Waakabinas Bryce Institute at the University of Toronto is a milestone, is a game-changing introduction. Certainly, we need research on antibiotics to treat resurgent strains of TB and genetic research to unravel our vulnerability to diabetes. But trickle-down research results from laboratory research are not enough. We need a construct of research that transcends current domains to address holistically the death-dealing horsemen of poverty, powerlessness, and anomie. The 94 calls to action of the TRC, self-determination in governance, the UN Declaration, all are about health. And pivotal to restoring health is weaving again the ethical infrastructure of communities, which elders would call the spiritual dimension of being alive well. The work of reconciliation is proceeding, led by Indigenous people and their allies, and you'll hear more about them as the day progresses, but we need all the help we can get. So I leave you with some questions. What is your responsibility for reconciliation? Where is your healing work situated? In colonized space? In collaborative space? Or do you imagine and reach for ethical space where knowledge shared from different directions and origins transforms our present reality to realize reconciliation? Nyawa, thank you for listening.